The declaration took 11 seconds to sign. Sikasa 7 pressed his mark into the document at 0600 station time, Vreth Standard. He did not read it before signing. He had written versions of this document 14 times across his career. The words did not change. Only the name in the second paragraph changed. This time, the name was Terran Collective. He said it once quietly, testing how it felt in his mouth. It felt like nothing. Most names felt like nothing until after the surrender. The war room around him was cool and wet and pressurized to the comfortable salt weight that Vreth bodies preferred. The walls ran calculation screens. Numbers moved across them in soft, orderly columns. 6 weeks, the model said. 8 if the humans had more warships than the initial survey suggested. He had personally reviewed the survey 3 times. He trusted it. He had bet internally on 7 weeks. The declaration was transmitted across 4 relay stations and reached Terran Collective space within the hour. Standard delivery, standard language. Near the bottom there was a line he had written himself 20 years ago and had used in every declaration since. It read, "Resistance beyond this point constitutes a species-level failure of rational calculation." He was proud of that line. It was clean. It was accurate. Every species that had received it had understood exactly what it meant. He filed the signed copy. He poured himself a drink of cold brine water. He began drafting the surrender terms in advance. Another standard practice. It saved time later. Outside, 40 warships were already moving. Oh, Admiral Yara Osei read the declaration at 0340 station time. Titan Station. Her aide, Lieutenant Fenn, had woken her personally. He stood 3 feet from her desk, holding the translated document, trying to read her face. Her face was not giving him anything useful. She read the declaration once, set her coffee down, read it again. Then she put it flat on the desk and looked at it the way a surgeon looks at something that should not be inside a body. "Pull me everything," she said. "Every war the Vreth Dominion has fought, every species, every outcome, every battle record on file in the Galactic Registry." Fenn hesitated. "That's 800 years of records, Admiral." "Then start now." He left. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The records came in batches over the next 3 hours. Osei read through the night. She had a habit with physical documents. She made small marks in the margins. Dots for things that mattered. Circles for things that worried her. Lines through things she already knew. By the 4th page, she had stopped making lines entirely. 14 wars. 14 species. Every single one had looked at the incoming Dominion fleet, run the numbers, and surrendered. Some surrendered before the first shot was fired. The longest conflict in all of Dominion history had lasted 9 weeks. That was the Karath Uprising, 300 years ago. The Karath had been stubborn by Vreth standards. They were a client state now, quiet, cooperative, paying their tribute on schedule. What marked itself in Osei's mind, what she kept circling until the ink was heavy, was the consistency. When every Dominion war followed the same pattern. First strike, demonstration of force, a pause while the target species ran their numbers, then surrender. It was less a military campaign than a transaction. The Dominion had never fought a species that did not understand the math. She looked up from the papers. Out her window was the void, and in the void, the running lights of 2 UEF destroyers on patrol rotation. She watched them move for a moment, slow, steady, patient. She thought about what it meant to understand math. She thought about what it meant to be a species that had spent 10,000 years doing math on itself, running numbers in 100 different languages, on a single crowded planet, between groups that shared air and water, and still found reasons to destroy each other. What that kind of practice carved into the bone of a civilization. What it left behind even after the wars ended. What it meant to hand that inheritance to the stars. She laughed. It was not loud. It was not the laugh of someone who found anything funny. It was the sound a person makes when something becomes clear that they would have preferred to stay blurry. Fenn, returning with another stack of printouts, heard it from the hallway. He set the documents on the edge of the desk. He left without asking. By 0600, she had a strategic assessment drafted. By 0800, she had called the Joint Command into the main briefing room. By 900, the meeting was over. The generals had walked in expecting her to request immediate diplomatic escalation. They had walked out quiet, and some of them pale, and all of them not saying the thing they were clearly thinking. She had not requested diplomacy. She had arranged the 14 Dominion Wars across the table in chronological order. Actual printouts, laid flat, edge to edge, and she had walked the room through the pattern, same opening move, same pressure applied, same calculation window, same surrender, every time, without variation, for 800 years, a species that had found one way to win and had been winning it so reliably that it had stopped being able to imagine any other outcome. Then she had turned to the single page in Vreth tactical doctrine that described their standard engagement protocol, and she had said one sentence. The historical record does not contain that sentence. Osei never repeated it. Fenn was not in the room, but General Marsh, second chair, the 23 years of active service, a man the border conflicts had made into something not easily shaken, stared at the table for a long time after she said it. Then he said very quietly, "God help them." He did not mean it as comfort. The framed declaration went up on the war room wall that same afternoon. Fenn hung it himself. He'd had the full translated text printed large, the Vreth seal centered at the top. He positioned it so that the bottom line, the one about rational calculation, sat exactly at eye level from where OC stood when she ran her briefings. Everyone who came into the war room read it. Nobody said anything about it. They didn't need to. 3 days after the declaration was signed, Sekasa 7 received the Terran Collective's formal response. His translation droids processed it in seconds and summarized the key points. The declaration was rejected. The Terran Collective cited 3 legal precedents, all internal, all from their own planet's historical record, none of them recognized under galactic registry law. They appeared to be arguing from a legal framework they had built for wars they had fought against themselves. He read the summary twice. Then he read the original text slowly, using his secondary language algorithms to move through the idiom. Near the end, there was a phrase that did not translate cleanly. His systems returned 3 possible versions, none fully satisfying. The closest approximation read, "We do not surrender to weather." He did not know what weather had to do with it. He noted it as a probable translation error. He filed the response in the standard pre-surrender archive, the folder where all initial rejections went before the target species reconsidered. He updated his internal estimate from 7 weeks to 9. He considered this generous. That night, on a different station in a different part of Vreth space, a junior data analyst named Quas II received the Terran Collective's response as part of her standard intelligence packet. She had been assigned to the Terran file because no one more senior wanted it. Humans were new to the galactic registry. Their file was thin. Her supervisor had called it a background posting, which was his way of saying it was unimportant, which was his way of saying she should not expect it to lead anywhere. She read the 6 paragraphs of the response. Then she read them again. And then she opened the Terran Collective's public historical database, the archive they had submitted to the Galactic Registry 3 years ago during initial contact, which the Dominion Intelligence Office had cataloged and largely set aside. And she began reading from the first entry. She had flagged this database twice before as potentially relevant context. Both times the time allocation had not been approved. Now she did it on her own hours after her shift ended, with a cup of cooling nutrient broth on the desk beside her. She read for 4 hours before she stopped. Not because she had enough, because she needed to sit still. The humans had a word that appeared across thousands of years of their records. The word was attrition. It meant losing more than the other side, for longer than the other side, until the other side stopped. It was not a tactic in any Vreth military framework. Vreth doctrine was built on efficiency. You applied precise force. The target calculated. The target surrendered. Attrition was not a strategy anyone with a working numerical framework would ever choose. The humans had not chosen it as a strategy. They had lived it as a way of existing. Every major conflict in their recorded history, and there were many, layered on top of each other across centuries on a single planet, between groups separated by distances a Vreth warship could cross in an afternoon. Every one of them had eventually been decided not by the superior force, but by the side that could absorb loss longer without stopping. They had practiced this against each other for thousands of years. Quast 2 opened a new document. Well, not an official report. She didn't have the clearance for what she wanted to say, and the language she needed was not the language of intelligence summaries. It was something else, more like thinking written down before it disappeared. The first line she wrote was, "They do not think of surrender as math. They think of it as failure. These are not the same thing." She read that line back. It felt correct and also like it was not enough. She kept going. Outside her window, 40 Dominion warships were crossing the dark toward Kepler's gate. She knew their timeline. She knew their projected casualty models. She had reviewed them that morning as part of her standard packet. She looked at the documents on her screen. She felt something that had no precise name in her language. The closest word she had was a technical term used in probability modeling, a term that meant the moment you realize your initial parameters were wrong. She saved the document. She flagged it for her own review. She went back to reading. The declaration hung on the war room wall at Titan Station, catching the blue light from the tactical screens every time they cycled through their display rotations. OC stood in front of it late that night, alone, the day staff long gone. She read the bottom line one more time, the one about rational calculation, the one that had worked 14 times in 800 years. She thought about the 14 species that had received this document, that had done the math, that had made what the Vreth called the correct choice. Once she thought about what kind of species found that choice correct. She thought about what kind of species didn't. She turned off the office light and went back to her desk. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The Battle of Kepler's Gate began at 0200 local colony time. Nobody had planned it for 0200. That was simply when the Dominion fleet arrived. 40 warships dropping out of fold space in a loose formation, the largest of them 3 times the length of anything the human colony station had docked in its 7-year history. They came in clean and unhurried, the way something comes when it has never needed to rush. Fleet Commander Vasek III gave the opening order from the bridge of the command ship, calculated outcome. He had led 11 corrective engagements over his career. He was considered one of the better tactical minds in the Dominion's Western Theater, which was a title that had never been seriously challenged because the Western Theater had not produced a difficult engagement in 60 years. His fleet fired the first volley at 12 human vessels holding the gate perimeter. 3 human ships were destroyed immediately. Clean strikes. Efficient. The remaining 9 took damage that Vreth damage models classified as mission compromising. The kind of damage that, in every prior corrective engagement, caused the surviving ships to pull back, regroup, and begin transmitting the preliminary codes that meant they were ready to discuss terms. The 9 human ships turned back into the engagement. Vasek III looked at his screen. Then he looked at his tactical officer. Then he looked at his screen again. "Run the damage assessment again," he said. "It has been run, Commander. The assessments are correct." The 9 human ships were not retreating. They were not regrouping. They were pressing forward into the gap the destroyed vessels had left, which was tactically irrational because the gap was now covered by 3 Dominion guns that had just demonstrated exactly what they could do to a human ship at that range. Vasek III began issuing updated orders. This was fine. This was a deviation from the standard pattern, but deviation was manageable. He had contingency structures. What he did not have a contingency structure for was what happened next. Captain Dara Mensa of the UEF destroyer. Persistent was not following the engagement plan anymore. The engagement plan had lasted approximately 4 minutes, and then Captain Quo's ship had gone dark, and the Dominion's left flank had shifted to cover the gap, and the plan had become a document that described a situation that no longer existed. She was operating on something older than any plan. 20 years in the UEF had given her a library of tactical instincts she could not have fully articulated. 12 of those years had been spent in active engagements of various sizes, 3 of which had gone as planned, 9 of which had required her to make decisions faster than any formal protocol could accommodate. The UEF trained for this. Not explicitly. There was no class called What to Do When Everything is Different Now. But it was in every simulation they ran, every after-action review she had ever sat through. In every conversation with commanders who had been in situations that went sideways and come out the other side, the assumption baked into UEF doctrine at a level so deep it had become invisible was that the situation would change. Always. The plan was a starting point. The situation was the real document, and it was being rewritten in real time. And you read it, and you responded, and you did not wait for someone up the chain to tell you what the new page said. VASIC 3's contingency structures were designed for an opponent that sent new orders up the hierarchy and waited for new orders to come back down. The waiting gap was where she lived. The battle lasted 11 hours. In Vreth tactical records, the standard engagement timeline for a corrective operation of this scale was 6 hours maximum. In VASIC 3's pre-battle estimate had been 4. The Dominion fleet won. This needs to be said clearly. When the smoke cleared, metaphorically, there is no smoke in a vacuum engagement. The Kepler's Gate colony station had been largely disabled. 3 of its 7 defense platforms were destroyed, and 6 of the human vessels that had started the engagement were gone. The Dominion fleet won, at 6 times the projected casualty rate. VASIC 3 filed his after-action report from the medical bay of the calculated outcome, where a damage control team was addressing a wound he had sustained when a conduit line failed near his command station. He wrote the report with the precise, measured language that Dominion officers used for these documents, because that language was a container, and containers were useful when the contents were difficult. Near the end of the report, he wrote, "The human forces demonstrated an unusual pattern of decentralized tactical decision-making that produced results inconsistent with their material capabilities. Individual ship commanders appeared to make significant deviations from expected doctrine in real time without waiting for central authorization. This should be noted as an anomaly." He marked it as an anomaly. He did not know what else to mark it as. He transmitted the report and accepted a sedative for the wound and did not sleep well. WAS 2 received the battle report at 0630 the following morning. She read it once. Then she brewed a second cup of nutrient broth. She did not normally drink 2 cups before noon, and read it again. The casualty numbers sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She pulled up her private document, the thinking file she had started 3 days ago, and added a line beneath the first one. They do not wait, they decide. Every one of them decides. She opened 3 additional analysis programs and began cross-referencing VASIC 3's anomaly note with the human historical database she had been reading on her own time. She was looking for precedent, some record of a human military engagement in which decentralized command decision-making had produced results like this. Faster responses, stranger angles of attack, units behaving as though each one carried the full picture inside itself. She found it on page 41 of a conflict they called the Second World War. And then she found it again in something called the Border Wars of 2089. Then again, and again, and again. It was not an anomaly. It was architecture. The humans had built their military doctrine around the assumption that the chain of command would break, that communications would fail, that the officer above you might be dead before you needed an answer from them. They had spent centuries of their own wars learning this, failing at it, losing badly when they forgot it, and building it deeper into their training each time. The result was a force in which every individual unit carried enough understanding of the larger goal to act intelligently without direction. The Dominion's forces were excellent when their communication hierarchy was intact. The gap between an unexpected situation and a new order coming back down the chain was, on average, 4 to 7 minutes. 4 to 7 minutes was a very long time. She filed an official report. This was not her private document. This was formatted correctly, cited correctly, structured in the precise language her supervisors required. It took her 3 hours to write and was the most careful thing she had produced in 4 years of service. The conclusion was unambiguous. She had worked hard to make it unambiguous because she knew that ambiguous conclusions were easy to file away. The conclusion was, based on battle performance at Kepler's Gate and a cross-referenced analysis of Terran collective military history, this analyst recommends immediate ceasefire and diplomatic resolution at whatever terms the Terran collective is willing to accept. Unless continued corrective engagement carries strategic risk that current Dominion doctrine is not structured to manage. She submitted it at 1400 station time. Her supervisor read it at 1600. He sent it back with a single annotation. Analysis does not account for Dominion material superiority. Revised conclusion. She stared at the annotation for a long time. She did not revise the conclusion. She archived the report in her own files. She opened her private document and added 3 more pages of thinking that she could not put into official language. Then she added a new section at the top of the document and labeled it simply, "Things that are going to happen." She began a list. It was not a short list. Vasek 3's after-action report reached Sikosa 7 at Vreth High Command 2 days later. Sikosa 7 read it with the same methodical care he brought to all documents. When he reached the casualty figures, he stopped. He went back to the projections his models had produced before the engagement. He compared them. He ran the comparison 3 times. Then he called his chief strategist, a long-serving officer named Deadliest 1, and asked for an explanation. Deadliest 1 had already read the report. He offered 3 possible explanations. 1. The initial survey of human military capability had been inaccurate. 2. The specific humans at Kepler's Gate were unusually skilled compared to their species average. 3. The anomaly Vasek. 3 had noted about decentralized decision-making was a real tactical feature rather than a one-time event. If the answer was 1, the survey team would need to be replaced and a new assessment commission, which would take 6 weeks. If the answer was 2, it was a local problem that future engagements at other sites would not repeat. If the answer was 3, it required a more significant doctrinal review. Sikosa 7 asked Deadliest 1 which explanation he believed. Deadliest 1 said carefully that he thought it was most likely a combination of 1 and 2. Sikosa 7 agreed. He updated his timeline estimate from 9 weeks to 11. He noted this in his personal log as an acceptable adjustment. He authorized a new survey team to reassess human military capacity. He did not commission a doctrinal review. In the Kepler's Gate colony, the repair crews worked around the clock. Captain Mensa's ship, Sarge the Persistent, was docked with its entire starboard array burned through and 1 engine offline. She had walked the damage herself that morning, moving slowly through the corridors with a flashlight in places where the power was still not restored. She had done this with every ship she had commanded after every engagement, not because her chief engineer required it, but because she needed to see it with her own eyes. What had been broken, what it had cost. In the engine bay, 3 members of her crew had died when a secondary explosion followed a direct hit. They were not the first crew members she had lost. The not first-time quality of it did not make it easier. She had found over 12 years that people who told her it got easier were wrong, and people who told her she would stop feeling it were wrong. And the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to her about this specific weight was an old commander of hers who had told her, "You carry it, you keep going. Those are not 2 separate things." She walked back to the bridge. She had a briefing to run, new positioning, new patrol patterns. The Dominion fleet had pulled back to regroup, but the sensors said they were not gone. They were simply far enough back to reassess, and the Kepler's Gate colony had maybe 2 weeks before they reassessed their way into another attempt. She had 2 weeks. She sat down in her chair. She pulled up the tactical display. She had work to do. Quas 2 was still reading. Somewhere in the human records, she had found a piece of writing, not military doctrine, not tactical analysis, from a human philosopher from several hundred years ago. And the translation was rough, but one line came through clearly enough that she copied it into her private document. It read, "The purpose of suffering is not that it destroys you. It is that it teaches you exactly how much you can absorb and continue." She read that line 4 times. Then she looked at the casualty numbers from Kepler's Gate again. 6 human ships gone, hundreds of human crew. By Dominion models, losses like that on the first engagement should produce a species whose political will was now fractured. Leaders who could not justify continued resistance to their own population. A people running the math and arriving at the only logical answer. She looked at the intelligence feeds from Terran collective news networks, which the Dominion monitored as a matter of routine. The humans were not calculating. They were building. New ships in 3 separate construction yards running double shifts. Recruitment numbers up in 2 major population centers. Public broadcasts from their government that contained none of the language of diplomatic retreat. One phrase appeared in several broadcasts that her translation program flagged as idiom rather than literal. It approximated in her language to, "We are just getting started." She added it to her list. Then she closed the document and sat in the quiet of her office and thought about what kind of species said things like that after losing 6 ships and several hundred people. She did not sleep well either. None of them did that week, not the ones who were paying attention. The Oran ascendancy opened the betting pool on the 43rd day of the conflict. This was not unusual for the Oran. They were ancient, post-biological for 3,000 years. Their consciousness distributed across a network of crystalline processing lattices that spanned 2 star systems. They had watched a great many conflicts from a great distance and had found over the millennia that betting pools were a useful framework for engaging with events too small to require their direct involvement. The terms of the pool were simple. Participants wagered on how many days until the Terran Collective transmitted the preliminary codes that signaled readiness to discuss surrender. The starting odds, calculated from Dominion historical precedent and the current material gap between the 2 forces, placed the median estimate at 60 days. Generous, given that Kepler's Gate had technically been a Dominion victory. The Oran found the humans mildly interesting. No more than that. They found most things mildly interesting from a sufficient distance. The Shal Collective's interest was less mild. The Shal were a fungal hive mind, their consciousness distributed through spore networks that threaded across 3 planetary bodies and the debris fields between them. They did not bet. They observed, cataloged, and grew. When something genuinely new entered their model of the galaxy, they expanded their observation accordingly. The humans were new, not new to the galactic registry. They had been on the books for 4 years now, but new in the way that a strange growth pattern is new to a mycologist who thought they had classified everything in this particular forest. Worth more attention, worth longer study. The Shal began dedicating additional processing capacity to the Terran file. They had questions. They were not hostile questions. They were the questions of something that finds itself genuinely unable to fit a new thing into any existing category. The Rekai Confederation said nothing officially. They had been a Dominion client state for 60 years. Client state was the diplomatic language for what had happened after the Dominion's corrective engagement with the Rekai ended in the standard way. Calculation, math, the correct answer. And the subsequent 60 years of quiet, cooperative, on-schedule tribute payment that the Dominion filed as a successful outcome and forgot about. The Rekai had not forgotten. They watched the conflict feeds through the same relay networks the Dominion used, was because the Dominion had built their communications infrastructure and saw no reason to give the Rekai access to anything else. This meant the Rekai watched through Dominion-curated summaries, which were accurate in their facts and careful in their framing. But numbers were numbers. The casualty figures from Kepler's Gate moved through the Rekai political networks in quiet, private channels, translated into their own language, read in homes and community halls and small government offices on 3 different worlds. Nobody said anything publicly. They were very good at not saying things publicly. 60 years had made them excellent at it. The Gren were watching from very far away and had already begun reinforcing their border stations. On the 47th day, the Terran Collective reached out to the Rekai Confederation, not through the Dominion relay network, through a frequency the Rekai had not used in decades, an old band, pre-Dominion, from the years when the Rekai had still been choosing their own communications architecture. The message was not diplomatic in the traditional sense. There was no formal opening language, no registry protocol, no request for a meeting. It was a data package, technical files, engineering schematics for 3 weapon systems, adapted from standard UEF designs and adjusted, with notable care, for Rekai physiology and manufacturing capability. At the bottom, a single line of text. It did not make any demands. It did not propose any arrangement. It simply said, "These are yours, and do with them what you think is right." The Rekai Minister of Internal Affairs read the transmission 3 times. Then she called a meeting. Then she called another meeting. Then, 6 days later, she signed an authorization for a classified internal project that had no formal name in the official records, but which the people working on it referred to, in private, as the Remembering. They began manufacturing, quietly, slowly. In facilities, the Dominion inspected on a biannual basis, which meant there were 22 months between the last inspection and the next one. 22 months was a long time when you were remembering something important. The humans did something else the galaxy did not anticipate. They talked about the war in public. Not propaganda. Every species did propaganda. This was different. What are their public communication networks ran debates, criticism of military command decisions, protests in population centers, academic arguments about whether the current engagement strategy was the optimal one. An opposition political group released a lengthy document accusing the government of insufficient transparency about casualty figures, and the government was required, under their own legal system, to respond. They did respond, with the actual figures, publicly. The Orion observation team processing this data flagged it as a potential instability signal. A species arguing with itself during an external conflict was, in every model they had, a sign of fracturing political will. The kind of internal division that preceded collapse and surrender. They updated the betting pool. The median estimate dropped to 50 days, when what the Orion models did not account for, what none of the watching civilizations had a framework for, was the possibility that a species could disagree loudly and persistently about the method of a thing while remaining in absolute agreement about the fact of it. The humans were arguing about how to fight, not whether to. The distinction did not register as significant to anyone who had not spent 10,000 years practicing it. To the Orion, disagreement was disagreement. To the humans, it was maintenance. The engine running a diagnostic on itself at speed. And while they argued, they built. 3 construction yards running double shifts became 7. 7 became 12. And the production numbers that began appearing in the intelligence feeds 3 months into the conflict sent Quas-2's analysis programs into brief processing loops because they were inconsistent with what a 4th-century spacefaring civilization should have been capable of industrially. She ran the numbers twice. She requested a source verification. The sources were verified. She sat very still for a moment. Then she understood. They were not building the way a young spacefaring civilization builds. They were building the way a civilization builds that had done this before, in a different medium, in a different era, when the ships were made of metal and floated on water, or flew through air instead of vacuum. The process was older than the technology. The capacity was not new. And they had simply been applying it to other things for a few centuries, and now they were turning it back. Old muscle memory. She added it to her document. She filed an updated intelligence report to her supervisor. Her supervisor read it and wrote back. Material superiority remains with the Dominion. This analysis is noted. She started keeping a secondary private file, separate from the thinking document, just numbers, just the production figures and the projected fleet sizes and the timelines. No analysis, just the shape of what was coming. She did not know who she was keeping it for. She kept it anyway. On the 91st day, the Dominion deployed the obliterators, 7 siege platforms, each one roughly the size of a small moon in visual profile, though the internal mass was considerably less. They moved slowly, and the way things move when they are large enough that speed is irrelevant. They had been used twice in Dominion history, both times in the closing stages of corrective engagements that had lasted longer than projected. In both prior cases, the target species had received notification of the obliterator's deployment and transmitted surrender codes within 72 hours. Nobody wanted to find out what 7 planet-class siege platforms actually did. Sicasa 7 authorized the deployment with the calm certainty of a man playing a card that had never failed. The notification was transmitted to the Terran Collective through official galactic registry channels, as protocol required. A deployment notice, the coordinates, the timeline. The 72-hour window began. What do you are? Osei received the deployment notification in the war room at Titan Station. She read it standing up, which was how she read things that required immediate decisions. She read it once. She looked at the tactical display. She looked at the updated fleet positioning data on the secondary screen. She looked at the image of the obliterators that the intelligence package had included. 7 pale shapes moving through the dark in loose formation, unhurried. She called her engineering command. "I need targeting solutions for 7 large moving objects," she said, "assuming a firing position here, here, and here." She marked 3 points on the tactical display. Her chief weapons engineer, Commander Alexei Park, looked at the image of the obliterators. He had been in the UEF for 18 years. She had never seen him look uncertain. He looked uncertain now. "Admiral," he said carefully, the size of those platforms means conventional munitions would—" "I know what conventional munitions would do," she said. "I didn't ask for conventional solutions. I asked for targeting solutions. Give me what we have and then tell me what we need that we don't have yet." Park looked at the image for another moment. Then he nodded once and turned to his team. The 72-hour window passed, then 96 hours, then 120. No surrender codes were transmitted. Vasek 3, reviewing the intelligence feeds from his repositioned command ship, noted in his personal log that this was unusual. He did not file an official report because there was nothing in official Dominion military protocol to file. The obliterators had worked both previous times. There was no contingency document for them not working. He looked at the image of his fleet's current positioning. He looked at the projected human production numbers that his intelligence team had finally finished processing. He thought about the casualty rate at Kepler's Gate. He thought about the 11 hours. He wrote in his personal log, in language much less formal than his official documents. "I don't think they're going to stop." He had not filed a personal log entry in 4 years of commanding ships. He did not entirely know why he had started now. In the Oran Ascendancy's observation network, a flag was raised. Not by the betting pool administrators. By a senior analyst, post-biological, 3,000 years old, Soy had reviewed 14 separate interstellar conflicts from a safe observational distance, who had been watching the human production numbers with growing attention for the past 30 days. The flag was not about the obliterators. It was about what was happening in the human shipyards while the obliterators were in transit. The analyst wrote a short summary and circulated it to the Ascendancy Strategic Review Committee. The summary contained one sentence that the committee would later identify as the moment the betting pool stopped being amusing. The sentence read, "At current production rate, the Terran Collective will achieve material fleet parity with the Dominion Corrective Force in approximately 14 months, without accounting for the potential mobilization of additional manufacturing capacity that current models suggest they have not yet deployed." The betting pool was quietly closed. Nobody asked for their winnings. Quas 2's secondary file, the one with just the numbers, just the shape of what was coming, was running out of space. She opened a new file and kept going. She had stopped flagging things for her own review. She had stopped hoping her supervisor would read the reports and see what she was seeing. She had started writing her document differently. Less like thinking out loud, more like a record. Like something she wanted to exist after the fact, when someone needed to understand how this had been allowed to happen. She wrote carefully. She chose her words the way you choose words when you believe they will matter later. The last line of that day's entry read, "They did not calculate the math we expected them to calculate. They looked at the obliterators and started solving a different problem. This is not irrationality. This is a different kind of rationality. I do not think we have ever encountered it before. I do not think we were prepared for it." She saved the file. She started a new page. Outside in the dark between stars, 7 siege platforms continued their slow approach toward a species that was not transmitting surrender codes. It was transmitting targeting data. Sicasa 7 began reading Quas 2's reports on the 200th day of the conflict, not because anyone told him to, because he had run out of other explanations and the reports were the last stack in the file he had not touched. They had arrived in his office over a period of months, routed up through 3 levels of command that had each marked them as noted and moved on, and they had accumulated in a corner of his system archive, the way things accumulate when no one is ready to deal with them. He read them in order. Oldest first, he was a precise and methodical reader. He did not skip. He did not skim. He gave each report the same careful attention he gave to everything, because in 40 years of service, Careful attention had been the instrument that kept his record clean. By the fifth report, he had stopped annotating. By the eighth, he was simply reading. By the 12th, it's the most recent, filed 6 days ago, he sat back in his chair and looked at the calculation screens on his war room wall for a very long time. The screens were not showing the same numbers they had shown at the start. The projections had been updated 14 times in 8 months. Each update had moved the timeline out. Each update had come with a supplemental note from his chief strategist, Deadliest, explaining why the adjustment was reasonable and temporary and did not represent a fundamental problem. He had accepted each note. He looked at all 14 adjustments now, laid against each other in a single view. The line they made, moving steadily outward across the graph, was not the line of a conflict resolving on schedule. It was the line of a conflict that had stopped moving toward resolution at all. He called Deadliest. Deadliest arrived promptly, with the manner of a man who had been waiting for this call and had prepared for it in the way experienced subordinates prepare for conversations they know are going to be difficult. He stood correctly. He had his data ready. Sicasa 7 did not ask for the data. He asked, "When did you know?" A pause that was too short to be polite and too long to be innocent. "Know what, High Arbiter?" That the standard model was not going to produce a standard result. Delos One was quiet for a moment. Outside the war room's pressurized walls, something in the ventilation cycled. The screens ran their numbers. "After Kepler's gate," Delos One said finally, "the casualty ratio was not within any normal variance. That was 7 months ago." "Yes, High Arbiter." Sicasa 7 did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in his professional life. He simply looked at Delos One for a long moment in the particular way that 40 years of authority produces. The look that does not require volume. Delos One looked at the floor. "Prepare a full strategic reassessment," Sicasa 7 said. "Everything. Starting from first principles. Not from our existing doctrine. From actual current data." "Yes, High Arbiter." "And pull the file on this analyst." He turned the screen so Delos One could see the name. "Quas 2. I want her transferred to my direct advisory staff." Delos One left. Sicasa 7 looked at his calculation screens. He had a feeling he had not experienced in 40 years of service. It took him a while to name it accurately. It was the feeling of having been wrong. The Rekai Confederation withdrew from the Dominion client-state framework on the 219th day. The document was 3 paragraphs. It cited administrative reform as the primary motivation. It was the most polite act of political defiance in Rekai history, which was a history that had not previously contained much defiance of any kind. 60 years of being a client state had made them very good at language that said one thing and meant another. The Dominion received the document and noted it. They were in the middle of a war and had no immediate capacity to respond with force, which the Rekai had calculated carefully before filing. The Dominion sent a formal objection through registry channels. The Rekai acknowledged receipt of the objection, and then they went back to their manufacturing facilities and continued the remembering. On 3 other worlds that had been Dominion client states for periods ranging from 30 to 90 years, similar documents were drafted. Some were filed, some were held in reserve. All of them existed. The Dominion noted each one. They were very busy. The Oran Ascendancy held a classified strategic review. 7 senior analysts, 14 days, full access to all available intelligence on the conflict's current state. The question they were asked to answer was, if the Vreth Dominion is unable to resolve this conflict on favorable terms, what does that mean for the Ascendancy's long-term strategic positioning relative to the Terran Collective? They produced a document, 140 pages. The full document stayed classified. Once the summary was circulated to the Ascendancy's governing body, the summary was 2 pages. The final paragraph of the summary contained a sentence that an Oran historian would later describe as the most significant thing the Ascendancy had written in 2 centuries. "We recommend initiating non-hostile exploratory contact with the Terran Collective at a time of our choosing, before a time of their choosing is imposed on us." The governing body read the summary. They read it again. They approved the recommendation. They did not act on it immediately. The Orin had been post-biological for 3,000 years and had no concept of urgency that operated on a scale shorter than decades. But the recommendation existed. That was new. OC was winning. This was the fact that did not feel the way facts are supposed to feel. The Dominion fleet had been pushed back from Kepler's gate and had not retaken it. 3 of the obliterators had been disabled. Not destroyed, disabled, but disabled was enough because the remaining 4 had stopped advancing and pulled back to a holding position that made it clear whoever was commanding them had done some very fast recalculating. 12 new UEF vessels had come out of the yards and joined the line. The Rekai Confederation's withdrawal had thinned 2 of the Dominion supply lines. The intelligence feeds were showing fractures in Dominion fleet coordination that had not been there at the start. She was winning. She knew what winning looked like. She had studied it, planned for it, pushed toward it every day for 8 months. Now it was arriving incrementally, the way these things always arrived. Not clean and sudden, but piecemeal and exhausting. She had a cactus on her desk. She did not entirely know when it had appeared. Fenn had placed it there sometime around month 4, and she had not told him to remove it, and now it was simply part of the desk. It was small, cylindrical, pale green. It required almost no maintenance. Anyone who knew anything about cacti would tell you that the worst thing you could do to one was overwater it. She watered it every day. Measured amounts, same time each morning, before the first briefing. She used a small measuring cup. Fenn had watched this practice develop over 4 months and had said nothing, because there are things you do not say to a commanding officer, and this was one of them. She did not know she was doing it in any way she could have explained. It was just something that happened in the morning now, between waking and the briefings, a fixed point. Something that needed exactly what she gave it and would tell her, in the visible language of continued living, that it was enough. The cactus was doing fine. 2 weeks into month 8, she walked her ship. Not her ship. She was stationed, not deployed. But she thought of Titan Station as hers, the same way you think of any space as yours after long enough. She walked its corridors at 0200 when she could not sleep, which was happening more frequently now, and she stopped at a viewport that looked toward the outer dark. She was thinking about a specific decision she had made in month 5, an authorization. She had signed the order in 3 seconds and moved to the next item in the briefing and had not revisited it because there was no time, and the decision had been the correct tactical call, and she knew this. Knowing a decision was correct was not the same as being at peace with what it required. She stood at the viewport for a while. She went back to her office. She watered the cactus even though it was not morning, and she had already watered it that morning. Then she sat down and opened the tactical display and did the work because the work was the only thing she could do with any of it, and doing it was the only answer she had that was worth anything. On the 231st day, the Dominion opened a diplomatic channel. Not a transmission of new demands, not an ultimatum, a query, a request for communication. And the language was formal and registry standard and very careful. And underneath the careful language was something Sicasa 7 had put there deliberately. An admission that the standard corrective framework was not producing expected results, and a genuine request to understand why. He had drafted the message himself, 4 times. The first 3 drafts had been discarded because they preserved too much of the standard framing. The posture of a dominant party offering terms to a lesser one. The 4th draft dropped the posture. Just the question. The question was, why have you not performed the rational calculation? He transmitted it. He waited. The Terran Collective Diplomatic Corps received the message and brought it to Ose because she was the one who would know what it meant better than anyone. She read it. She read it again. She set it on her desk next to the cactus. She thought about 14 species, about 800 years, about a line she had framed on the war room wall. She called her diplomatic lead, Ambassador Chen Wei, and told her what to send back. The response was 3 words. The Dominion's translation systems processed it in seconds. The 3 words came back to Sicasa 7 in his war room at 0900 station time. Breath standard. He read them. He sat with them for a long time. The words were not angry. They were not triumphant. They were not the language of a species trying to wound. They were the language of a species stating something it considered obvious. Something it was slightly surprised still needed to be said. We don't stop. That night, Sicasa 7 opened a new document. He had been opening documents his entire career. Declarations, strategic assessments, surrender terms, operational orders. He had a template for all of them, built across 40 years of service, refined and trusted and clean. He had no template for what he was trying to write now. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a surrender demand. It was not a strategic order of any kind. It was approximately a proposal, a request to talk, not about terms of defeat or terms of resolution. Those would come later if this worked, but simply to talk. To be in the same room as the species that had sent back 3 words where a surrender code was supposed to be, and to try to understand what they were. He had never written anything like this. He started from the beginning, first sentence, then the second. It was slow. The words felt wrong in the ways that first drafts always feel wrong. He deleted and rewrote. He found that the standard language of Dominion diplomacy kept pushing its way in, and he kept removing it, because the standard language carried assumptions he could no longer afford. He worked on it until 0300. He saved it. He looked at what he had. It was not good yet, but it was honest. And honesty was a thing he was going to need more of now, because the honest picture, the one he had been looking at since he read Quas 2's 12th report, was very clear. 8 months in, a war that was supposed to last 7 weeks, the Dominion had superior technology, superior firepower, superior strategic infrastructure built across 8 centuries of unbroken success. And somewhere in the yards of the Terran Collective, more ships were being finished. Right now, while he sat here, he saved the document. He began working on the second draft. He had a feeling he was going to be at this for a while. The war ended on the 341st day. Not with a final battle, not with a decisive strike that broke the Dominion fleet in one clean moment. It ended the way most things that have been slowly losing pressure for months finally end, with a formal acknowledgement of what had already become true. The Dominion's corrective fleet pulled back to a holding boundary. Sicasa 7 transmitted a request for formal negotiations. The Terran Collective transmitted acceptance. A time and location were set. The galaxy noted this. Each species noted it differently. Oinum. The Rikai Confederation held a public gathering on their primary world the night the ceasefire was announced. Not a celebration. They were still officially a post-client state transitional government and had 17 open diplomatic disputes with the Dominion that were going to take years to resolve. It was quieter than a celebration. People gathered in open spaces and community halls and said very little because there was too much to say, and most of it did not fit in words yet. In one of those halls on a world that had been quietly remembering itself for 8 months, an old woman who had been born before the Dominion's corrective engagement, who remembered a time before the math, before the surrender, before the 60 years of cooperative silence, sat in the back of the room and looked at the newsfeed. She did not cheer. She put her hand flat on the table in front of her, very deliberate, and left it there, like she was making sure the table was still real. The Oran Ascendancy drafted their first official contact message to the Terran Collective that same week. They spent 19 days on the wording. The Oran were careful with language, as any 3,000-year-old post-biological civilization tends to be when it is doing something it has not done before. The final message was precise, warm in the way that ancient things manage warmth, carefully from a slight distance, and entirely honest about what had prompted it. We have been observing your conflict. We would like to talk. Not about the conflict, about you. The Terran Collective's diplomatic corps received it and read it and passed it to the relevant people, and one of whom brought it to Osei as a matter of routine briefing. She read it. She set it down. Tell them yes, she said. Then she went back to the tactical display because the ceasefire was 11 days old and there was still a great deal of positioning and monitoring and work that needed doing, and the cactus still needed watering, and the briefing still started at 0700. Course 2 was selected as the Dominion's lead surrender delegate. The official reasoning, documented in the High Command's records, cited her deep familiarity with Terran collective intelligence and culture as the primary qualification. This was accurate. The unofficial reasoning, which Sakasa 7 understood and had quietly arranged, was that she had been right from the beginning. Makra and the people who had been right from the beginning were the ones who needed to be in the room now, because the people who had been wrong had already done enough. She received the appointment and sat with it for a long time. She had 341 days of documents, the private thinking file, the numbers file, every report she had filed that had been annotated and returned, the secondary file she had kept because she thought it would matter after the fact. It had mattered during the fact. Nobody had read it during the fact. That was a distinction she was going to carry for a while. She packed the files. She prepared her materials. She boarded the diplomatic vessel. She brought the journal. The formal negotiation site was a neutral station, registry administered, positioned equidistant from both parties' current fleet boundaries, staffed by registry personnel who had spent the past 11 months watching the conflict with the specific exhaustion of people forced to be impartial about something that was difficult to be impartial about. Osei arrived first. She came with a small staff: Fen, General Marsh, 2 diplomatic advisors, and a legal team. She wore her uniform and her rank insignia, and nothing else that was ceremonial, because ceremony in this context seemed like the wrong register. She stood in the main meeting hall, neutral gray walls, registry standard lighting, a long table that was deliberately designed to avoid giving either end a sense of dominance, and she looked at the room. She thought about the declaration on the war room wall back at Titan. She had left it there. She had not taken it down after the ceasefire. She was not sure if she was going to take it down. The Dominion delegation arrived 17 minutes later. Quas 2 walked into the room and saw Osei standing at the window. She had read everything available about Osei: biographical files, command records, tactical assessments, the intelligence summaries her office had compiled. She had a very complete picture of Osei on paper: the career, the decisions, the record. The picture had not included how still she was. Not stillness from uncertainty. Not the stillness of someone composing themselves before a difficult performance. The stillness of someone who had already done the difficult thing and was now simply waiting for the next thing to begin. Quas 2 had spent 11 months being afraid. Not afraid of the war. That was a different feeling, more operational. Afraid in the specific way you're afraid when you can see clearly what is happening and no one around you can be made to see it too. That kind of afraid is a lonely afraid. It makes you careful with your words because you know they are not landing anywhere. And that carefulness calcifies into something heavy over time. She looked at Osei. She recognized in the stillness something she could not name in her own language. She thought the closest human word was probably cost. The formal sessions lasted 4 days. Territorial boundaries, fleet withdrawal timelines, registry oversight provisions, the Dominion's obligations to its former client states, which took most of the 3rd day, and produced language that the Rekai Confederation's diplomatic observers, mice watching the proceedings through registry feeds, would later describe as the most useful document produced in 60 years. Osei and Quas 2 did not speak privately during the formal sessions. That was not what the formal sessions were for. On the evening of the 3rd day, they ended up in the same corridor, one of the station's secondary observation areas, a narrow room with a long viewport looking out into the dark between systems. Neither of them had come there for company. They had both come there for the dark, the way you seek out quiet spaces when the day's language has been very loud for a very long time. They stood there for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who do not share a language natively, but who have spent months reading each other's world. Quas 2 spoke first. Her translator rendered it correctly, but the phrasing was slightly formal, the way phrasing is when you learned a language through documents. I wrote a report, she said. On the 44th day, I recommended ceasefire. I know, Osei said. A pause. How? The intelligence files your side shared in the preliminary disclosure. Your report was in there. I read it the first day. Quas 2 looked at her. I read it and I thought, Osei said, that whoever wrote that was either very smart or very scared. Both, Quas 2 said. Osei nodded once. Both is the accurate answer most of the time. They stood in the viewport quiet for a while longer. Outside, the dark held its distance. Quas 2 reached into the case she was carrying and took out a physical object. A storage drive, slim and flat. Formatted in Vreth standard but translated across to cross-species registry format. The kind of thing that could be read on either side's equipment. She held it out. My records, she said. From the beginning. Everything I saw and wrote and couldn't make anyone read. Osei looked at it. Why are you giving me this? Quas2 thought about the question for a moment. She had thought about it before, on the diplomatic vessel coming here. She had prepared an answer. Now she found the prepared answer was too small. Because you should know, she said finally, that someone on our side saw it coming. I want there to be a record that says someone saw it coming, and I want the record to exist on your side, because I do not entirely trust what will happen to it on mine. Osei took the drive. She looked at it for a moment. And then she put it in her jacket pocket, close to the body, the way you carry something you're going to read carefully later. Thank you, she said. Quas 2 nodded. They went back to the formal session. The closing ceremony was broadcast on all major registry networks. It was held in the station's main assembly hall. A larger space than the negotiation room, better lighting, a podium. Registry protocol required a public statement from both parties. This was standard for conflict resolutions of this scale. A formal close, a document signed in view of the feeds. The Dominion statement was delivered by Sikasa 7, who appeared via transmission from Vreth High Command. He was precise and formal and shorter than expected. He said the things that needed to be said. He did not editorialize. Osei delivered the Terran Collective's statement in person. She stood at the podium in her uniform with no notes. She had written and discarded 4 versions of this statement over the past 3 days. The final version she had arrived at was not what her diplomatic advisors had suggested. It was not what any of the templates in UEF communications protocol had suggested. It was what was true. She looked at the assembled room, the registry officials, the Dominion delegation, the observers from the Shal Collective and the Oran Ascendancy and the Rekai Confederation, and a dozen other species who had spent 341 days watching and calculating and updating their models. She said, "Congratulations. You just declared war on the galaxy's deadliest species." A pause. The room was completely still. Or now you've faced the consequences. She stepped back from the podium. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the room moved again. People shifting, feeds cutting to analysts, the machinery of the galaxy's political response beginning its work. And Osei walked back to her seat and sat down and looked at her hands and was very glad when the proceedings moved forward and there were other things to pay attention to. In a mess hall on a war-damaged UEF frigate, docked at Kepler's Gate for ongoing repairs, Captain Dara Mensa watched the closing ceremony on a handheld screen. She watched Osei step to the podium. She heard the 2 sentences. She watched the 4-second silence. She turned the screen off before the applause started. She finished her meal. She put her tray away. She went back to the bridge to check on the repair schedule, which was behind by 2 days and needed to be managed. There was work. There was always work. In the months that followed, each watching civilization updated its internal classification of humanity. The Oran Ascendancy's classified cultural assessment, 400 pages, the product of 8 analysts working for 3 months, used a phrase in its conclusion that translated approximately as, "A species that learned to survive by never learning that survival was optional." They filed this in their strategic division, in a folder that had previously been nearly empty, under the heading, Entities Requiring Sustained Attention. The Shal Collective sent their first direct diplomatic message to Earth 9 days after the ceasefire. The message was long. It contained 17 distinct questions, each phrased with the careful precision of something that had spent a long time formulating them. None of the questions were hostile. Most of them were, at their core, a single question asked different ways. How do you carry this and still function? The Terran Collective's diplomatic corps drafted a response. They consulted historians, psychologists, philosophers, veterans, an unreasonable number of people who had opinions about human nature and its origins. The final response was 80 pages long and contained, in its opening paragraph, an honest admission. We are not entirely sure. We have theories. We would like to discuss them with you. The Shao Collective wrote back within the hour. Yes, come. The Rekai Confederation built a monument. It was not placed on a prominent world. It was on a small secondary colony, the one where the first manufacturing facility had been built, in the months of the remembering. The monument was not ornate. It was a flat stone with a single inscription that did not mention the Terran Collective, or the Vreth Dominion, or the war at all. It simply said, "We decided." The Gren sent a very polite diplomatic communication to the Terran Collective. The communication expressed goodwill and hope for productive relations. In its final paragraph, it noted respectfully that the Gren had always considered their sector of space to be a quiet and uneventful one, and expressed a hope that it would remain so. The Terran Collective wrote back warmly and said they completely understood. Sumifuri. Quos-2 returned to Vreth space and spent 6 months writing a full account of the conflict from the inside. Everything she had seen and noted and been unable to make anyone hear. She submitted it to the High Command Archives, where it was classified. She submitted it to the Galactic Registry, where it was accepted and filed in the public record. Then she applied for an interspecies exchange position. She had 17 questions she wanted to ask in person. She had the notes in her private document. She had been adding to them all the way through the negotiations and the journey home, and was still adding to them. She wanted to ask them to someone who would be able to answer. Osei was at her desk on the morning after she returned to Titan Station. The cactus was still there. Fen had watered it while she was at the negotiations. It looked exactly the same as when she had left, which was the nature of cacti. They did not require much, and what they required, they made clear in the most obvious possible terms. And when they received it, they simply continued. She sat down. She pulled out Quos-2's drive. She held it for a moment. She thought about reading it now. She thought about saving it for later. She thought about the 412 days since she had read the declaration in the cold dark of 0340 and laughed the kind of laugh that did not mean anything was funny. She thought about General Marsh saying God help them and meaning it the way he'd meant it. She thought about the decision in month 5 that she still woke up with at 0200 as the one that had been correct and had cost what it cost and was going to keep costing for as long as it mattered to her, which was going to be a very long time. She put the drive on the desk next to the cactus. She would read it. Just not today. Today she had 7 briefings starting at 0700 and a full damage assessment report that needed her sign-off, and 2 command appointments that had been waiting 3 weeks because she had been at the negotiations. She picked up the measuring cup. She watered the cactus. She set the cup down. She opened the first briefing document. The cactus, as it had been since month 4, was doing fine. Outside the viewport, Titan Station's running lights cycled through their morning pattern. Ships moved on their patrol rotations. The stars held their positions, which they had been doing since long before the war, and would continue doing long after anyone in this room had stopped mattering to the record. The record, though. The record was going to contain 341 days, a declaration that had worked 14 times and then didn't, 7 obliterators that had worked twice and then stopped, a junior analyst who wrote 12 reports that nobody read until it was almost too late, and then one person read them and transferred her to the right room, and 2 sentences delivered to a silent hall that the galaxy would be unpacking for a long time. The work was there. The next page of it. Waiting. She started reading.